All right, so welcome to episode 2 of the Forge Your Strength podcast. We officially have a name this time. Last episode, we didn't have a name. We didn't know what was going on, but figured had to get that going as quick as we could, and we settled on the Forge Your Strength podcast. Part of the reason I chose that, it defines sort of the ethos of my business as a whole. But I really like the term forge because it implies that there's a difficulty, there's a challenge, there's some heat that is required in order to incur changes, beneficial changes down the road. So a lot of what we're going to explore with this podcast has to do with mental health, performance psychology, and everything in between. And I'm honored to have my guest Frankie Corrado here for episode 2. Frankie, how you doing, my man?
I'm good, buddy. Happy to be here. It's been a little while since we've seen each other, but thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So Frankie and I, for those that don't know, we actually worked together in the performance setting through some pretty challenging times in Frankie's career, through some injuries and whatnot. And as you can see from that fresh face, he's no worse for the wear. And he's doing really well now on the other side of his playing career, working with TSN, which is something we're going to get into. But to start with, the first question I want to ask you is, what is something like the word confidence mean to you? It's something that we hear about in sport, and obviously you have such an expansive background in playing sports, not just at any level, but at the professional level and the highest professional level. So what is something like the word confidence mean to you?
It's a good question because we hear the word confidence all the time. Player lacks confidence, player has a lot of confidence, but sometimes we don't necessarily know what that means to the player, and everyone's a little different. For me, when I had a lot of confidence when I played, everything seemed easy, right? Like the game just kind of came to you, and situations throughout the game just presented themselves to you, and you would take them. Something like if I'm a defenseman and I'm going back for a breakout, I know there's a forecheck coming, but for some reason, I saw the guy in the middle of the ice that I could hit on the breakout, and I'm skating up the ice after. I'm like, damn, that was easy. That was great. I feel confident about that. And those would kind of stack up as the games would go on. And then, you have like your little visual highlight reel that lives in your head as a player. And I found when I was playing confident, the highlight reel was very strong. And there was a lot of positives in it, and I could draw on it. And it was almost like I was in this state where I couldn't really think of anything to get me out of that. Now, I wish that lasted a little longer at times, because when you're not confident, the game seems challenging, and it can seem like you're always playing this kind of uphill battle, where, I described that one situation. You're going back for a puck, and now you look back the same way you did before, but you don't see that middle option anymore. And now you're getting hit into the boards, and now you're trying to scramble and say, okay, now I can't let this guy lift my stick and get the puck off me. So you see the difference, where before it was easy. I made the play, and then the other way, it's like now I'm thinking, and the more you're thinking, it seems like the less confident you are. And now that highlight reel that I talked about is not necessarily as positive. So it's different for everyone. But when I was playing with confidence, the game felt easy. I felt like the game was kind of opening up for me. And when I wasn't confident, it was like, oh, there's a puck that bounced over my stick, or I'm trying really hard. I can't do it tonight. And, it's a delicate balance for players and athletes alike, trying to balance that and, not force things too much when they're not going your way. Right.
Mm.
And, when you have that confidence, and everything does feel a little easy, you almost you never want that to end.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I appreciate that. What would you say that it's something, because in our world, in the performance world, they call it the flow state, which is obviously something that everyone's heard. It's like everything's coming easy to you, like you said. But would you say it's something that you're thinking about a lot when you are confident, or are you thinking less and reacting more?
Thinking a lot less. Yeah,
Okay.
I would say the more I was in my own head thinking things, that's when I would get in trouble. When I was confident, when the game felt easy, it felt like there was no thinking involved. Everything was just instinctual, and it wasn't even reactive. It was proactive. It was like I could see a play where maybe I'm in the offensive zone and I see my forward coming around the net, and I knew instinctually I could jump into an open pocket of ice and make something happen. But if you're not playing with that confidence, you second guess yourself because you have the highlight reel of maybe someone turned that puck over and it went down 2-on-1 and you got scored on. You didn't like the way that felt, and you maybe held on to that a little longer. You see how the thinking comes into play here. But when you're confident and the game is kind of coming to you, it's like, nope, it's instinctual. I'm jumping in. I know exactly what I want to do. And if it doesn't happen, then we'll be okay. So there's a little bit of like a reassurance when you're playing with confidence as well that maybe people overlook. But the term flow state is something I hear a lot and heard a lot over the course of my career. And I think it's a great definition and a great term to describe how things feel. The game just flows. It's easy. You don't have to think. And at the end of the night, you feel really good about yourself.
Yeah. Because I think oftentimes when people think about confidence and they say, oh, that's a confident person, or that's someone you would describe as confident, it's almost as if the anticipation is that, or the expectation is that person knows what the outcome is. They're confident about what the outcome is going to be. But it sounds like from your perspective that it's almost the opposite, right? It's almost like an acceptance that things might go wrong, but I'm confident that I can actually deal with those issues when they come and have some kind of solution to come out from the other side of it.
And I used to laugh when coaches would deal with players that weren't playing with confidence, and they would kind of just tell them, here, go have confidence. Yeah, it's easier said than done. And even when coaches used to say you need to earn your confidence, what that really means is you need to execute plays at a high level. And that's how you kind of earn your own confidence, where internally now in your head, you're just thinking about positive things that have happened to you recently rather than things that have gone against you. It's not necessarily earning earning your ice time merit-based. It's almost like you just need to execute under pressure, under duress, and that is how you gain confidence. And I used to laugh at coaches that would say too, in practice, right? Like practice is great, but it's different than a game. Like confidence comes from doing those things well in a game. Yeah, you want to do it well in practice because of good habits and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the game is where you earn your confidence.
Yeah, well said. I think it's such an interesting topic because you're touching on an element that maybe I didn't anticipate talking about now, but I'd love to explore that more, in that how communication impacts confidence. Because not just communication with yourself and your self-talk, but how other people, the expectations that the coach might have and how they talk about what those expectations are for you, how that can impact your thoughts as a player, and then ultimately impact your confidence and of course your performance.
Yeah, it really varies. Like I think the best coaches that I had throughout my career, they didn't use a one-size-fits-all approach for all their players. The best coaches really knew how to get the most out of certain players, and maybe there were different ways of communicating with certain guys based on their personality, based on how they are, that they could find ways to get more out of them. The coaches that generally use the same approach with every player, those are the guys whose message got stale and people tend to tune them out because it just sounds like a recording. It sounds like the same old thing over and over again. And I think if you, as players, athletes, you're not dumb, right? Like you can tell when something's fishy. And you can tell when someone makes a little bit of an extra effort to try and get to know you and know how to get the most out of you. With that being said, there's no problem at all with coaches being demanding and having high expectations on players. And it doesn't mean everything's like a walk in the park and everything's really easy. Like people talk about players coaches. Players coaches are still very demanding, can still raise their voice, can still have that fire and intensity. But where they differ from people who aren't players coaches is the fact that the players coach has a different way of sending the message maybe to you as opposed to another player. So maybe it's a little more tailor-made to get something out of you. It's not easy, but being a coach is not easy. Being an athlete is not easy. That's why, you get paid a lot of money. You reach the pinnacle of your sport. It's not meant to be easy. So, similar to athletes, that kind of mindset, that also exists for coaches. So I always appreciated the coaches that, they would communicate with you. There were times where they knew when to lay off, but there were also times when they knew that they need to put the gas to the pedal with you and expect more out of you. You can see the difference as a player between the one-size-fits-all approach and the approach where it's like, okay, I know what I need to do to get this out of player X and maybe this out of player Y.
It's interesting because I think maybe from the athlete's perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're probably searching for a little more consistency with yourself in your self-talk, how you talk to yourself. You know the situations that you've been in, you've probably been in them before, and maybe you're searching for some kind of consistency to get yourself out of those challenging situations when it's not in that flow state, when things aren't going the way you thought they would. But
yeah, I think a lot of players too, like as much as we want to know things are black and white,
yeah,
right? Like there's a lot of gray area that exists. And I think that's where if you can fill in the gray as best you can with either a player or a coach with the communication, that's where a lot of it lives, right?
mm,
And it's easy to say things are black and white, but oftentimes they're not. You also want to know where you stand. Like there's nothing wrong with a coach being very direct, very honest, very upfront. And I had a coach tell me early on in my career, and I thought this was good advice. He goes, I'll tell you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear. And sometimes it sucks when you have to hear what you need to hear and not what you want to hear, because as players, like I'll be the first one to admit, I was a little self-conscious as a player. There were times in my career where you could say I was soft mentally, right?
mm,
And sometimes you need to find a way to get your head around facing adversity and facing things that you don't want to hear head on, accepting it and moving on from it. And I found the athletes that were really good at that, they were the ones that were able to find that confidence in that flow state easier than most. I was one of those players when I would really get hung up on something that I did wrong or something that a coach said to me, something that I may have heard. And it's like, it didn't do me any good. It hindered me and produced a lot of negativity. And I would hang on to that way too long. I always had an appreciation for the coaches that could find a way to fill in the gray area, and for the players that could really move on from any kind of negativity and leave it in the past.
I guess that comes with maturity, in that, like, you spoke about the coach telling you what you need to know versus what you want to hear, or what you need to hear versus what you want to hear. And that there's an element of trust there between you and the coach, right? Like if he's telling you something that you need to hear, the assumption there is that you trust that this guy's evaluation of what you need to hear is accurate.
Totally.
But
Yeah.
then I guess as you mature as a player and as a person, is that something where you're able to sort of you trust yourself in the evaluation that they're giving you, and you could take what you need from what they think you need?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point you bring up, because I think as a young player, when you're really eager to make a name for yourself and you want to, like, let's say you're trying to get to the NHL, right? And you really want to hang on to that spot and that opportunity. A coach tells you something, it's like, okay, that is the word of the Bible. Like, that
Yeah.
is exactly what I'm doing. I'm following that to a T because he told me that, right? And then as you get older, as you have that highlight reel and that confidence more and more entrenched into your game, into your brain, there are times where you can be like, okay, I understand what you're saying, but I also know this to be true as well, right? And it's not defiant, it's just confidence in your ability and your instincts. But when you're young, like for me, when I was a young player, I had a lot of different coaches early on in my career. I think I had 3 coaches in my first 2 years in the NHL with Vancouver. And then you have American League coaches. There's a lot of different voices that are telling you things. And you're like, okay, I need to absorb all this. I need to execute it all because they're telling me what I need to do to stay at the next level. And there we go again with that like black and white kind
Mm-hmm.
of philosophy, where really the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think as you get older, you have a little more confidence in yourself to say, okay, like I understand what you're saying, but I also know that, it's not so black and white.
Interesting. So you mentioned something there, that the difference between how you interpreted those messages around confidence as a player trying to make it to the NHL versus when you're in the NHL trying to hold that job. Can you talk a little bit about another buzzword that we often hear in performance psychology, and just, sports analysis as a whole, the concept of pressure? What was the pressure like, and how was it different in trying to make it to the NHL versus holding on to that job in the NHL? Or was it
Yeah,
different, or is it all just pressure?
for me, there was more pressure trying to stay in the NHL. Getting to the NHL, I did it often, right? I did it the first time I got sent down to the minors, and I got called up a bunch of times. So that I felt like that was never my roadblock. And
Mm-hmm.
so if I take you back to playing in the OHL, as much as I wanted to get drafted, I never felt pressure to get drafted because I kind of knew it was like a marathon. It was a long game, and eventually, if I played well enough, I could put myself in a position to try and get there. And hey, lucky for me, I got drafted, signed an entry-level contract. That was all great. That relieved some pressure from me because I knew I was getting my foot in the door. And then once I had my foot in the door, it was like, okay, now you're starting in the AHL. And hey, if you play well, you're one phone call away from the NHL. But I never really felt that much pressure there because I knew I had some more runway to kind of stay there. When I started feeling the pressure was when I had been given a few opportunities in the NHL and I could never really stick or solidify myself. And a lot of that had to do with, like we talked about, sometimes lack of confidence, sometimes a little insecure as far as my game. Is it good enough? Is it not good enough? Am I doing things right? You know, a lot of thinking involved. And then you start thinking, okay, like I've had 3 or 4 good opportunities to solidify myself in this league. I keep finding myself back in the minors. And I think that's when the pressure starts to come into play. But realistically, you know, you should probably A, not be thinking about that, but easier
Mhm.
said than done. But B, that same mindset where, you know, before when I was younger, it was like, oh, it's a marathon. Well, yeah, it still can be a marathon, even though you are in the NHL. And this whole narrative that you're going to run out of opportunities, that's something that's kind of just self driven. That may not actually be true. And, you know, even more specific to my position, being a defenseman, I was really trying to solidify and stick in the NHL at 22, 23. It's a very difficult thing to do. And then you see guys at 27, 28 that really hit their stride as defensemen in that league. But at the time, when you're younger, you don't think about that. All you're thinking is, I need to stay. I need to, whatever it is, financially, like, you know, my goal as far as sticking around. There's so many things that you can think about, and the pressure starts to mount. And I used to have this conversation with another player in the minors, and he had been up and down a lot throughout his career. He was an older guy at the time, and this rang true to me. He just said every time you get up to an NHL arena, you get called up, things just seem a little harder for some reason. And I
Mhm.
totally agreed with that. I don't know why that was, but whether it was practice or game, you know, things you could do a little easier in the American Hockey League just didn't come as easy in the NHL. And so, you know, there's just so many things in your head. And like we talked about, the players who are best at not thinking about those kinds of things and letting it go and just kind of focusing on what's happening in the moment and the task at hand. Those are the guys that had a little more success. If you bought into any kind of narratives as far as pressure or opportunities not going to be there in the future, or things being a little harder, or always trying to, you know, grasp onto what every coach tells you and do exactly that, being so black and white, there's a lot going on in your headspace there and making it even more difficult, not to mention the fact that you're playing against the best players in the world now every single game.
Hmm. That's one of the things I love most about you, buddy, is that like in an environment like the analysis of hockey in particular, we often get these kind of bland answers, but you do such a good job of going into detail and giving anecdotes about these specific topics and how they relate to your career as a whole, which is something I really appreciate about you. But one thing that you spoke about a couple of times so far is this idea of black and white versus the gray area. And I wonder if that's something that you see that has any relationship with this idea of the process versus outcome oriented mindsets. In performance psychology, they talk a lot about, you know, reducing the noise and trying to understand that oftentimes these symptoms of anxiety that you feel when performance isn't going well, or when you anticipate performance is not going well, we're looking at sort of outcomes that are binary, 1, 0, on or off. Is it going to happen? Is it not? Am I playing well or am I not? But it sounds like you were talking about something that's more process oriented and understanding and appreciating that, listen, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Okay, let me ask you this. So you
Yeah.
train people, right? You're into performance. A muscle, if a muscle or a ligament or a tendon is rigid, okay, versus supple. When it's supple, it's able to absorb a lot of different things and let it go. When it's rigid, okay, it may be really, really strong, but when that thing breaks, you're out and you're hurt for 4 to 6 weeks or months or whatever the case may be. So it's the same with your mindset. You want your mindset, your mentality to be supple. Okay, I absorbed something. I absorbed it. Now I let it go. Instead, like the way I was a lot of times, very rigid, thinking you're really headstrong, but really what you are is you're just hanging on for dear life because at some point it's going to rupture and it's going to
Mm.
hurt you more than it's going to do you well. So it's the same with with training and muscles, and it's the same with the brain. So you know, that was one of the things I struggled with. But you know, you could see certain players where they could absorb it, and it was like, okay, absorbed it, moved on. Where if you were rigid and you were tense about it, it wasn't going to help you in the short term, and it was going to do some long lasting effects in the long term.
That's it. That's beautiful. That's the exact sort of the how the idea of the physiological kind of impacts the psychological as well, and vice versa. So how your body responds to these thoughts and anxieties that you might have, and vice versa. How you can get out of your head by doing something physical and focusing on what you need to do better next time. So that's great. One thing I wanted to circle back on is this idea of the mental challenges in general when things aren't going well. But can you talk about injuries and specifically? And it's something that you and I have a relationship with. You know, that's how we first met, was through your ACL rehab. And what was that like from your end? You know, I think I have a good idea based on the conversations that we had, you know, throughout that time. But just speak about it from your perspective.
Yeah, very challenging. You know, when it first happened, I don't even think I understood the severity of an ACL injury. So when I first got diagnosed, when I first heard that, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know the recovery time. And as soon as the doctor told me it's about 9 months, like my heart sank into my chest and kind of broke down in tears, because at the time I was getting a really good opportunity in the Penguins organization after, you know, basically 2 years in Toronto with lack of opportunity, where I was very healthy and available, but just wasn't getting that opportunity. So that was really hard to deal with. And then, you know, kind of quickly accepted that and moved on to the rehab process, and totally didn't know what to expect as far as when am I going to progress, and, you know, when can I kind of move on from all these checkpoints as far as walking and riding the bike, lifting weights, and then moving on to skating and all that kind of stuff. So it was very new. It was very foreign. Luckily, I had yourself. I had other people around me to kind of lean on and ask questions. You know, other players that had been through ACL rehab as well. So I mean, that was great. But I think it was one of those things where, if we go back to something I talked about earlier, where you get a piece of information and you really just hang your hat around that, and you're like, okay, I need to do this. And I was so rigid in that. And yeah, there's a certain element of discipline to things, but when discipline goes too far, it turns into being a little too rigid, instead of being, you know, supple. And so I feel like I got caught up in a lot of things where I could have been a little more easygoing, but I felt like I was on this like mission to be so determined to come back better than I ever was, where, you know, I kind of forgot that, like, along the way, you need to give yourself a little bit of a mental break. You can only take so much, you can only handle so much. There's only so much capacity for our brain to operate at 100% intensity all the time. And so, you know, there were moments throughout that process where I really did feel a lot of burnout, but at the time I didn't notice it. Like, I look back at it now, and now I think, okay, like, I probably didn't need to ice my leg in an ice machine every single day for, you know, hours or minutes on end. You know, I probably could have taken a break every couple months instead of never missing a day. It's a long process, and it's kind of that fine line between discipline and giving yourself a break that I struggled with a lot. But you know, I think part of that process, you learn a little bit about yourself, and those are experiences now that I can carry into, you know, the next chapter of my life. And yeah, what I have, I wish I would have learned those things and realized them earlier. But you know, I used to say this a lot when I was playing. You just have tunnel vision as a player, right? Like, when it comes to off ice things, and not everyone does it, but some players do. They're so obsessed, they're so addicted, they've worked so hard to get to a certain point, and you don't want anything to change it. Injuries, whatever circumstances are around you, you just want to keep progressing and keep climbing and solidify yourself. And you just get this tunnel vision where, you know, there's a bigger picture at play that you need to keep into perspective. But you know, during that process, it became very hard.
Yeah, really well said. And I think sometimes there's a paradox to some of this stuff where the expectation is that the athlete learns as they go, because you have to go through it in order to learn how to manage these things. But then the flip side of that is like, how do I do that on the go at a rate of speed that's enough that I can actually learn the lesson and keep going and build off of that, versus that moment passing me by and being like, oh, I learned that lesson, I should have done X, Y, and Z, and then boom, the moment's gone, you know? So what
Yeah.
were some of the resources that you leaned on in order to kind of, make that process as efficient as possible?
Yeah, so the number one thing that I think has helped me, and I don't do it as much anymore, and I think that's a credit to where I'm at now with my mental health and the space between my ears, but meditation really helped me. And I was doing 10 minutes a day. I think the longest I had was almost a 400 day in a row streak on the Headspace app that I thought was really helping me. And honestly, to take that 10 minutes, I really looked forward to it every day. I would do it after practice, coming home to try and, separate myself from the rink and everything that happened there. And my night, where, let's say there was hockey Frank and personal Frank, and that
Mhm.
10 minutes kind of helped me separate the two. And it really helped me kind of clear out a lot of the clutter that would maybe be in my head. Like we talked about, things you hear at the rink, maybe things you had happen to you on the ice in practice or a game, whatever the case may be. It felt like it kind of decluttered my head. So I really enjoyed that. There were also a lot of times where I reached out to help. Maybe it was a sports psychologist, maybe it was, like a mental strength coach. And I think those were good resources for me. I think I learned a lot. There was also a lot of different people I had reached out to because maybe, one voice I just wasn't getting heard, or wasn't really, I wasn't absorbing as much, and I just maybe thought it wasn't going anywhere. And there were, a couple people where I thought, man, that's great. I learned a lot today. I got a lot from that, and I feel much better because of it. Excuse me. Ultimately, we're not trying to get rid of anything. We're not trying to get rid of anxiety. We're not trying to
Mhm.
get rid of stress. What we're trying to do is learn how to deal with it and cope with it, and not let it fester and linger and turn into anything more. And once I kind of realized that I could let go of things, and I didn't have to chase a thought the rest of the day. It was much better for me.
Yeah, that's so well said. And I think you touched on something that's pretty interesting, because inevitably, like a lot of these things that we gain from therapy, from mental strength coaches, from these sorts of interactions with people, is an appreciation for the process and recognition of the feelings that you have for what they are, without trying to let them kind of control your day, as you said. But in that, you spoke about, it's not necessarily like you find one psychologist or one mental strength coach and boom, you have that connection right away. There's actually a process in finding that right person. So I think there's a bit of a battle that people have to go through in being patient with themselves, that I tried therapy, it didn't work. Well, it
Right.
might be something that you have to try it more than once, just like that's probably one of the lessons that therapist is going to teach you at some point.
I would even say this, like there was a point where I was talking to someone once a week, right?
Mm.
There was a point when I was playing for the Leafs when I was talking to someone twice a week. And I found that like my progression later in my career, where I was talking to someone once a week, turned into twice a month, then turned into once a month, because I felt like I was in a healthy place, that
Mm.
I could handle the stresses and anxiety that were coming my way. Not to mention that when you do talk to someone, that's great. But what you really need to do is apply what they are teaching you or talking to you about in your own personal life. So it's not like you can just go back to doing everything you're doing, and you're going to talk to someone once a week and now everything's going to be okay. Like there's a certain level of active participation that you need to be able and willing to do as an athlete, as a person, or else you're kind of just spinning your wheels a little bit. And so, the lessons you learn, the things you try and apply, something like meditating every day, or trying to meditate a few times a week, was really helpful to me. And as much as we talk about earlier on, we talked about how you take one thing and you kind of like really run with it and blow it up. I could see how maybe that could get lost in here too, because you're talking about now, okay, I need the stress of I need to talk to someone once a week, the stress of I need to use the
Mm.
coping mechanisms that they're teaching me. I need to meditate, let's say 3, 4 times a week. So you think there's going to be more stresses, more
Right.
things on your plate that way. So there's still a balance to be had as far as, okay, if you missed a day of meditating, it's not a big deal. You'll catch up tomorrow. If you had a bad meal on a Friday night, it's not a big deal. Like you'll be okay, right? So um, those are kind of things that you, I guess, learn from talking to people, from finding the right kind of headspace, and then you see how that can creep into your on ice or your on field kind of productivity, and how things can. Hey, I made a mistake. Just like when I ate pizza on last Friday night, I made a mistake. I pinched when I shouldn't have. That's okay. The next time I'll be fine. I won't do it. And if I do it again, I'll learn my lesson eventually. You almost learn to like be easier on
Mhm.
yourself, like a little more forgiving to yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. I love that. Is this something, is it something obviously like you spoke about the idea of finding that help from a professional level. So someone who's in the field who does this daily as a job, as a career, as a profession. Do you ever rely on teammates for help through some of those, psychological challenges that you're experiencing?
Yes, I would say on most teams there was at least one, maybe two guys, and I think it differs for everyone. But on most teams I played on, I had at least one, maybe two other players that you just for whatever reason you kind of hit it off. Maybe you have some similar experiences in life. You hang out with. You got some things in common, and you can bounce ideas and just share some experiences. Where I really saw that come to life was when I went over to Europe and I was playing in Sweden, and we were a really close import crew. There were three of us, then there were four of us, and but we like to this day still talk on a daily basis. And I think a lot of those kind of days sitting at the lunch table, going for coffee, those are great memories, first of all, but those built a really long lasting relationship where those are guys that were at my wedding, and we still remain really good friends. So it's nice to have teammates to talk to that stuff about, but it's not like you're talking to everyone about that, right? Like I felt like there were a lot of players maybe I was uncomfortable having those kinds of conversations with, but when you do have someone, it's a really nice feeling. And even with what I'm doing now, on camera, on the radio, analyzing hockey, I found that my teammates, as far as the analysts go at TSN, have been awesome. Like I think every other analyst at TSN has had some kind of helping hand with me as far as giving me a little bit of advice or what to expect or how to approach certain things. So I've been very fortunate that way as well in my second career.
Any little bits specifically that stick out as far as advice from either those teammates or psychologists or strength coaches or the crew at TSN?
So the first time I went on camera, one of the people who reached out to me was Craig Button, who's been around a long time. He's been
Mhm.
on TV forever, and he was a GM and a scout. He's such a nice guy. And he said something to me that I still think about almost every day when I go on television. He said, "Be patient with yourself." And I wish I heard that more when I was playing. Be patient with yourself, because you know the way the schedule is, okay? Like if there's a 7 a.m. workout and you're training a hockey team, there's no patience involved. Everyone is there early and they're sitting around ready to wait for the 7 a.m. workout. And once that workout hits, it's go time and the stopwatches are out. So there's not a ton of patience, right? But really, if you learn to have that patience early on in your career, you could not be so hard on yourself, not demand perfection, just kind of like be patient and be a little more forgiving with what you do on the ice or on the field, whatever the case may be. So I really appreciated that advice from Craig. Um, and then you know what, like there's always that like stereotypical advice that you get from certain people: play your game, have fun, all that kind of stuff. It's all great, but there's just for some reason sometimes those things lack context,
Mhm.
right? They can be a little narrative based. But I think the one that really stuck out was be patient with yourself. Not be patient, but be patient with yourself. And I wish that that was something that I realized and harnessed a little earlier in my career.
Yeah, I love that. I think that speaks to the importance of there's these expectations that we place on ourselves in whatever we're doing, whether it's an athlete like yourself or someone like me who's trying to build a business, etc. It's always focusing on like, what can I do better, more, go, high intensity, high performance, keep going, aim for more. You know, you got to be better next week than you were this past week. Whereas, how do we balance that out? And oftentimes these simple pieces of advice, be patient with yourself, which I think that's great, often serve just to kind of balance the opposite end of that emotional spectrum, where we're expecting such a high volume, high frequency, high rate of performance. How do we balance that out? Appreciating the moment for what it is, taking a step back to maybe look back and understand that, listen, I'm in the NHL right now, and I took a long time to get here. Let me just take this one moment and be patient with myself and appreciate it for what it is.
Yeah, and so like if you even look at hockey, right? Like players make the best plays and decisions at around 80% speed. It's really hard to make high quality plays at 100% speed. Your brain can't catch up to how fast you're moving. And so maybe the same can be said for our capacity as far as our mental capacity, right? So if you're doing things at an 80% intensity rate, you feel like you can get a lot done, you can process what's happening, you can process how to move on from things. But if you're trying to operate at 100% intensity all the time, that's, I think, where you get into that rigid state of mind where you're just ready to kind of pop at any second. Where, you know, if yeah, you can get to 100% for sure, but you know, there's a certain sweet spot there where you have enough intensity, but you know, you're still pretty supple in how you think about things, how you handle things, how you absorb things, how you move on. And that's probably serves people better. It's a little more sustainable in the long run.
Last question. Before Craig reached out to you, were there any of the skills that you learned from your time as a player and all the things that you've spoken about so far that you applied going into it from a preparation standpoint, from an expectation standpoint, from a mental challenge perspective?
Yeah, you know what? I think it's the preparation standpoint for me. Like, you know how prepared athletes are before they go into any kind of game or event, you know, making sure their bodies are well fed, you know, like warmed up, and you feel like you're ready to go. Well, I feel like this, you know, being on camera, and let's say we're coming in for an intermission, and now you got 3 minutes to talk about the period that just happened. So you watch the period, right? You're prepared on that. But now we go commercial break, we come back, we may do another 3 minutes on, can this team make the playoffs? Or is this player, you know, what are you seeing out of this player? And it's like, okay, now that's where your preparation comes into play. Have you watched the team play? Have you researched anything? Have you read articles? All that kind of stuff. So I feel like the preparation of playing a game is probably the first thing and the most relatable thing that I took to this second career. And you know, I found there's been games, admittedly, where I wasn't as prepared as maybe I would like to be, and it felt very similar to maybe not having my best game on the ice. Now I'm probably in a better state mentally to handle that. I'm a little more patient with myself, and I understand, you know, that I can let it go a little easier, and you know, give my best effort the next time, right? But the preparation is the biggest and most relatable thing for me.
Awesome. So what's next for Frankie here? What's coming up on the horizon for you?
A lot of the same, you know, very busy with radio, television, trying to, you know, get as many reps as possible while still maintaining that balance that we talk about. And I really enjoy it. I like the fact that I'm watching a lot of hockey, a lot of NHL hockey. I feel like it's invigorating, and quite honestly, like, you grow up your whole life watching hockey, playing hockey, and you know, I'm at the point where I couldn't really play any longer without getting hurt, and this is pretty much the second best thing.
Was that something that you felt was important to you? Maybe you didn't have a time to think about it during your career, but when you felt like, okay, I'm ready for that next stage now, leaving my professional playing career behind, did you know you wanted to stick close to hockey, or was it something that just kind of came to be?
I think I knew I wanted to stay close to hockey. I think I probably would have pursued, if this situation never came up, I would have pursued like a player development or assistant coach kind of role, to try and see if maybe that's something that I would have liked. But this opportunity presented itself, and Really took to it, really liked it, really felt like a lot of, I don't know if validation is the right word, but purpose
Mm-hmm.
probably is the right word. Like felt a lot of purpose doing it. And honestly, like when you enjoy something, it doesn't feel like work. So very happy doing it and hope to kind of just build even more and do it for a long time. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's one lesson I can learn here with the way my playing career went to this second career. I think I had this obsession with wanting to be amazing and really good right away, right? And I think now that I've been through that as a hockey player, I would like to be good at this for a long time. I don't really necessarily think I need to be um, so established and so solidified at a young age. But to have the sustainability and do it for a long time, I think means much more. Like when we go back to talking about that marathon versus sprint scenario.
Yeah, buddy. Honestly, I tell you this all the time. You're doing such a great job at TSN. I really mean that. And there's multiple people that have reached out to me and told me that independently, unchecked. So it's really awesome to see. And something like this shows how insightful you are. So I really appreciate it. And we'll chat again soon, my man.
Thanks for having me, buddy. Hopefully we can get back in the gym together soon.
100%. Chat soon.